Hello, and welcome to the 2024 Educational Attainment of Chicago Public Schools webinar. My name is Ashley Leonard, and I'm proud to serve as Deputy Director at the To&Through project and to be your host today. For more than a decade, we've released this report in partnership with our colleagues at the Consortium on School Research to help stakeholders across the Chicago education ecosystem understand our shared successes and opportunities in our work to ensure all CPS students can achieve their post-secondary goals. And given the myriad challenges facing higher education and ongoing federal attacks on multiple fronts, it is more important than ever to provide clarity, spark curiosity, and drive collective action to ensure the progress Chicago has made in redefining post-secondary success continues. Despite the narrative that the value of college is declining, the majority of CPS students aspire to complete a degree. And as noted in the recent report from the Consortium and iWork, college is still the best way to ensure economic mobility, especially for low-income students and students of color. Before we get started, I want to briefly share a little about the work we do here at the To&Through project. Our mission is to create equitable education outcomes for Chicago public school students by helping education stakeholders use data for inquiry and impact. Today, you will see each aspect of our work in action. Data is all about sharing and analyzing multiple forms of data, similar to what will be shared from the report today, to create a shared understanding about the educational journeys and attainment of CPS students. Inquiry is about helping stakeholders make meaning of this data to shift their practice, which we aim to accomplish at the individual and collective levels today through the perspectives of our phenomenal panelists. And ultimately, we strive to make an impact by helping realize equitable learning experiences, pathways, and outcomes for CPS students from the middle grades through graduation. One of the best parts of working at To&Through is being in spaces like this, where we bring together the knowledge and expertise of folks from all parts of the system to create the conditions for young people to thrive. Our work to use data to bring people together is what today is all about. With that in mind, let's get a sense of who we have represented in this virtual room here today. My colleague Alex is now launching a poll, so you can tell us a little bit about your role in the system. Please choose the response that best describes your role in supporting Chicago's youth on their educational journeys. Got it. 75% of people have responded. We'll give it another 2 or 3 seconds before we close it out and get a good sense of who's here today. Wonderful. So we have a lot of nonprofit staff, researchers, and higher ed folks in the room today, which is really exciting. It's also always great to see parents and community members in these spaces as well. And I love doing this because it's a really great reminder of the vast network of people from across the city, state, and country who are dedicated to supporting young people. It's an affirmation of what's possible when we all work together towards a common goal. We have 3 goals for our time together today: to provide clarity on the educational attainment of CPS students from high school graduation through college completion, and to contextualize these outcomes historically and in the present moment. We want to spark curiosity about what's going well and where we need to improve through an engaging discussion with our expert panelists, focused on understanding our post-secondary access and attainment efforts here in Chicago and the implications for this work locally and nationally, given the current challenges of the moment. And finally, we really want to drive folks towards thinking about what is our collective action by helping each of you recognize the unique role you play in supporting young people on their post-secondary journeys, and how we can all work together to further improve the outcomes and experiences of young people throughout our city. Here's a quick overview of our agenda today that aligns to the 3 C's I just laid out. For clarity, I'm going to pass it over shortly to my colleagues, Shelby Mahaffie and Jenny Nagaoka, to go into detail about the data and key takeaways from this year's report. Curiosity will focus on insights from our panelists to help us all make meaning of this data and build our collective context around this work. And finally, we'll close with an opportunity for each of you to share an immediate next step to drive shared action and accountability for this work and where we hope to go next. Before I turn it over to my colleague Shelby, a reminder that throughout this next portion, please add any questions about the report into the Q&A function. Our team will do our best to respond to these clarifying questions throughout the presentation. I'll also try to leave time to take one or two of those questions at the end before we move on to our panel. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining us, and I'm excited to pass it over to Shelby Mahaffie to share more about the students represented in this year's data and the key component rates.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Hi everybody. I'm Shelby Mahaffie. I'm a research analyst at the To&Through project. And like Ashley said, Jenny and I will be walking through some of the key findings of this year's report. But before we dive in, wanted to start with a quick poll. It is anonymous. Don't worry, it's not a quiz. Just go ahead and take a guess if you don't know. But the question is, what percent of 2024 CPS graduates immediately enrolled in college? So I'm going to give everybody a minute to take a guess. All right. Alex, are we able to share results? All right. Thanks everybody who put in an answer. We're seeing some different answers here. Most people are saying 66%, some 58, some 46, some 30, some 72. Good guesses, but I think this really speaks to the purpose of the report. There's different ways of defining things, different data systems, different insights. Across the different systems in the city. And we've been publishing this annual report for 11 years now. And one of the goals is really to help everybody in the Chicago education community get on the same page and have a shared language about what is happening for young people in our city and how it's been changing over time. So we know that there's so many different actors working towards the same goals, so many different kinds of insights into the system. And one of the goals of this report is really to allow everyone to celebrate the high level progress that's been made, that's continuing to be made, but also to identify areas where there's more work to do and have a shared language for talking about that. So one more thing before we dive into the specific findings and outcomes, we wanted to ground us just a little bit in who the cohorts are that we're going to be talking about today in more depth. So today we'll be talking in the most detail about two CPS cohorts. The first is the class of 2024, whose high school graduation rates and college enrollment rates we'll be looking at in the most detail. And then the second is the class of 2018 whose 6-year college completion rates we'll be looking at. So a couple notes about the class of 2024. This is the class that started high school as ninth graders in 2020, 2021 during the pandemic. This was also the cohort whose immediate college enrollment was most affected by delays in the FAFSA revamp. And finally, this was the first class to be applying to college post Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard, which is the Supreme Court decision that ended race-based affirmative action. Thinking about the class of 2018, this is the biggest class of high school graduates and the biggest class of college enrollees in the history of the city to date. And these are also students who experienced the pandemic during college, likely for most of those students doing at least their junior year of college remotely. And as always, it's important to pair the quantitative data that we'll be talking about today with qualitative data, with survey data, with formal qualitative research, with focus groups, but also with informal conversations with students and families and educators. Before we get into the quantitative data, we wanted to take a little bit of time to share a couple of themes that came out of the Student Stories project that Jessica Vargas on our team has written based on interviews with over 40 CPS graduates about their experiences on their post-secondary journeys. You can actually find all of the student stories with filters for different pathways and different student groups on the website, but we wanted to share just a couple insights before we dove into the findings in the report today. So the first theme we wanted to highlight that came out in the interviews is the complexity of financial aid processes and the insufficiency of supports around financial need. This is a quote from a CPS graduate, Mahaffie, who said, quote, "I was just confused about something with my tuition. It's literally texting a man who doesn't like you. I'll send them an email. Okay, so I have a question about this. And they reply by not answering any of my questions." And then CPS graduate Leslie talking about the limited supports for students who are immigrants. Quote, "We are very limited. I've seen that for those of us who aren't US citizens, it's hard because they offer a lot of aid to citizens. I couldn't apply for FAFSA, but the STAR scholarship helped me a lot." A second theme that came out in the interviews was the importance of programs and spaces created by and for students of color. This is a quote from CPS graduate Chris. And then I think sophomore year was when I really started joining clubs and organizations, and that really made me feel like I was adding to the culture of the school, specifically the Black culture of the school. And that has made me feel more successful. And then from Valeria, undocumented students at the university came together and talked about their experience. It was basically a community of undocumented students in college. I'm really grateful I had that. But then, as I was getting really involved during Undocu Week, COVID hit and we got sent home. And so, just as I was opening myself up, that's when we got sent home. So, yeah, my first semester was really difficult. And so, on that theme, finally, Jessica heard from students about how the pandemic impacted how they learned and how it exacerbated existing gaps in support. And here's a quote from Elijah that I think really sums up some of those themes. "It started to be a lot more evident that there are some things that have either been outdated or actually probably never truly worked anyway. I felt like they needed to change. And I think COVID really helped me see that. It completely exposed all the different ways that we could struggle as students, financially, academically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, like literally every aspect of what it means to be a person. School should be more than just survival mode all the time." So these are just some factors to keep in mind as we move to talking about the quantitative data and how the rates have changed over time. And as a reminder, you can find all of the stories with a lot more detail on the To&Through website, and I really encourage you to do that. But now let's get into the findings in this year's quantitative report. So you should be able to find the link, there it is, to the full report in the chat. Thank you, Jessica. And we are going to start here with the high school graduation rates. So as a reminder, we calculate four-year high school graduation rates based on cohorts of first-time ninth graders. And what we see in this figure is that we are reporting a slight dip this year in the high school graduation rate from the all-time high of 85% in 2023 down to 83.7% for the class of 2024. With a longer view, the high school graduation rate has still increased really significantly over the past decade. And another thing that we wanted to highlight here is that this does not necessarily reflect more students dropping out within 4 years, but actually reflects more students taking longer than 4 years to complete. We've actually seen slight increases in the number of students completing after 4 years, particularly for Latino students. Next up, we have immediate enrollment in college. So here we're going to see the answer to our poll from earlier. So in 2024, on the far right of the graph, 66% of graduates immediately enrolled in college, with 49% immediately enrolled in a bachelor's degree granting institution, and then an additional 17% immediately enrolled in community college. Again, the the bachelor's degree granting institution enrollment rate represents a slight decline from 2023, when around 51% of students immediately enrolled in a bachelor's degree granting institution. The rate of community college has been increasing slightly. One additional piece of context here is that the historical rates in this figure have actually been corrected slightly since the last report. We really want to give kudos to our partners at CPS and particularly at Von Steuben High School and OSCPA, the Office of School Counseling and Postsecondary Advising at CPS, who actually helped to identify a national issue with the National Student Clearinghouse data that was affecting all outcomes for reported outcomes for all students across the country, specifically in an undercount of college enrollment for students who participated in early college programs while they were still in high school. So if you're interested in more of the technical details around that, you can find a brief explaining the impact that correcting that undercount had in the chat. But finally, for now, let's take a look at the college completion rates for those cohorts of immediate college enrollees. So first, we will look just at the 6-year completion rates for students who immediately enrolled in four-year colleges and bachelor's degree granting institutions. So we're asking in this figure for the students who graduated from CPS in 2018, on the far right of the figure, how many of those students had completed a college degree by 2024, which is 6 years after they graduated from high school? And the answer is around half, around 52% completed a bachelor's degree. That's those first two categories added together. And then another 4% completed an associate degree, for a total of 56% of students who immediately enrolled in a bachelor's degree granting institution completing some kind of degree within 6 years. These rates appear very flat over time, but they do represent more and more college degrees being earned by CPS graduates over time. And that's because the numbers of high school graduates and college enrollees were still increasing each year for these cohorts of students. So in the next figure here, we're looking at 6-year completion for immediate enrollees in community colleges. And we see that these rates have been increasing over time, and that for the 2018 cohort of CPS graduates, 9.4%, again, that's those first two categories added together, of community college enrollees had earned a bachelor's degree within 6 years, and then an additional 23% had earned an associate degree or certificate and not a bachelor's degree. So stepping back a little bit to put some of these pieces together, we can start to think about what these rates mean for the real numbers of CPS graduates who are earning college degrees. So in this figure, the height of each bar is the total number of CPS graduates who immediately enrolled in college from that cohort. And then for the 2009 to 2018 bars on the left, you can also see what the degree outcomes were for those students in the dark and light green and dark gray sectioning. So for the class of 2018, in the middle of the figure, the completion rates that we looked at meant in practice all-time high numbers of college completers from CPS, with 5,800 bachelor's degree earners and an additional 1,568 students who completed another credential like an associate degree. But it also meant an all-time high number of students who went to college and did not ultimately complete a degree or credential. That's the 7,972 students in the dark gray in the 2018 bar. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to take us in a little more detail through how these rates compare to national rates, and then maybe most importantly, how these rates differ across different groups of CPS students.
Great. Thank you, Shelby. So I'm Jenny Nagaoka. I'm the Deputy Director at the Consortium on School Research and a Senior Advisor to the To&Through project. So Shelby just shared the numbers for CPS through the lens of the district as a whole. Another important lens we use to think about what is happening in Chicago is examining the 3 milestones by student characteristics. Because overall rates can mask the experiences and outcomes for students of different backgrounds, we need to understand both the general patterns patterns across the district and what it looks like for specific types of students in order to more effectively provide direct support and resources. Okay, in its equity framework, CPS highlights how both lenses matter and describes how equity depends on attending to both the needs of specific students and making school environments better for students overall. As a part of these efforts, we share data publicly to create greater transparency so that the Chicago education community can be on the same page about what is happening for young people in our city and how their experiences and attainment rates have been changing over time. And an important part of this is making sure that we do not shy away from sharing the patterns of disparities across student groups and raising critical questions so we can engage in more focused discussions about what we can do better. So to this end, in the Educational Attainment Report, you can see what percentage of students are reaching key milestones by different student characteristics. So we show this by race, ethnicity, and gender, English learner status, and disability status. I'll only be sharing a limited amount of information today, so I highly encourage you to explore further because it's crucial to think about how the patterns look for different types of students across the district. Because we know that opportunities and resources are not equitably distributed across the city, and we need to consider where and what types of supports and partnerships may be needed. Okay, and one of the key ways that we also make meaning of the attainment milestones is by understanding how CPS compares to national rates, both overall and for Black and Latino students. I'll be showing you the most current national numbers available, but as you probably, a lot of you are aware of, national comparisons are becoming harder and harder to find as federal data sources are becoming increasingly limited. So to start off, we're going to compare the high school graduation rates for CPS against the 2023 IPEDS national numbers. Um, Chicago has a slightly lower rate than the national rate, 84% versus 87%. Um, in CPS and the nation, Latinx students have the same high school graduation rates as the overall rate. Whereas the national and CPS rates for Black students are the same, 81%, which is somewhat lower than the overall rate. Moving on to college enrollment. The order is reversed. The CPS rate is 5 percentage points higher than the national rate provided by the 2023 Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we're at CPS at 66%, whereas the national rate is 61%. Among Latinx students, CPS students are actually much, much more likely to enroll in college than their counterparts nationally. It's a difference of 14 percentage points, 66% versus 52%, whereas Black students from CPS are slightly less likely to enroll in college than their counterparts nationally, 57% versus 60%. Finally, we look at the degree and certificate completion within 6 years for college enrollees. And here is where we see the largest differences between CPS and the national rates from the National Student Clearinghouse. 48% of immediate college enrollees from CPS complete within 6 years compared to 64% nationally. The difference among Black students is smaller at 9 percentage points, while Latinx students from CPS complete college at the same rate as Latinx students nationally. And this is particularly notable since Latinx students are also more likely to enroll in college. So taking a look at all three milestones and look at these patterns, we can see why it is important to disaggregate by student characteristics and to make national comparisons. For college attainment, Latinx students from CPS are much more likely to enroll and they complete college at the same rates as Latinx students nationally. High school graduation and college enrollment are the places where efforts from the district can have the greatest impact. And in these areas, CPS largely mirrors the nation. College completion, on the other hand, is dependent on a combination of high school preparation, what's happening in college, students, and their larger societal and economic context. And this is where we see the largest difference between CPS and national rates. College completion rates cannot change without a combination of efforts from secondary and post-secondary institutions and the larger education community. So we have shown you a lot of rates and understanding what the implications for current CPS students is complicated. Each year in our annual attainment report, we provide the Post-Secondary Attainment Index, or PAI, to help make meaning of the three key milestones: high school graduation, college enrollment, and college completion. The PAI provides a projection of how many current ninth graders will complete college if none of the rates change. I want to emphasize that this is not deterministic or predictive of what we expect to happen. Rather, it is a way of combining the current rates to understand what the implications are for students, and it prevents a starting point for thinking about why these patterns exist, what milestones they might be coming from, and what can be done to improve the patterns. So let's take a look at this year's post-secondary index for 2024, which is based on the current CPS rates that Shelby shared with you. So for the post-secondary attainments, we start with 100 ninth graders, and given current rates, 84 of them would graduate from high school. Of the original 100 ninth graders, 58 would enroll in college, 48 in a four-year college, and 15 in a community college, and 24 would complete a bachelor's degree, and 6 would complete an associate degree or certificate. So this means that given all the attainment rates that Shelby shared with us earlier, our projection is that 30% of current ninth graders would complete college. But always remember that this is an estimate based on current rates, and it's not a prediction of what will happen. So next, we're going to take a look at what the PAI looks like by race, ethnicity, and gender. And we look here, the differences by race, ethnicity, and gender demonstrate how critical it is to be looking at these differences by race, ethnicity, gender, and their intersection. While the rates for CPS have shown great progress over time, these efforts have not been sufficient to address the inequities for students of color, particularly male students. The PAI is a starting place for thinking about why these patterns exist and what we can be doing to improve these patterns. And so to emphasize how the PAI is not deterministic, we also want to compare what the PAI was in a given year to compare to what those students actually did. And you can see how far off the PAI can be in reality. And this is a place where we're always very happy to be wrong. So if you look on the far left for 2012, based on the what was available then in high school graduation, college enrollment, and college completion, we had projected that 21% of ninth graders would complete college. In reality, 27.3% of those ninth graders had a college degree, degree or certificate 10 years later. And this difference of 6.3 percentage points is actually a difference of 1,600 students. So all of the work that was being done inside and outside of the district, the efforts of students and families have led to this huge increase in the actual numbers of students who completed college compared to what we projected in 2012. So while the PAI is a useful projection to understand the implication of current rates, it has historically been an underestimate of what actually happens. And so today we have an estimate of 30% of ninth graders completing college. It's our greatest hope that 10 years from now, in 2035, we'll continue to be very wrong, and that many, many more students will have completed college than what we're estimating today. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ashley, who will take some of your questions, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenny. We've had a lot of great questions come up in the chat. Some of them we are going to try to save for after the panel, because I think some of these get to kind of what to do with this data, which is where we're going next. The one question I will kind of pose to Jenny and Shelby, before we move on and get the panel started, is just kind of sharing very high level, like who at CPS, both inside the district and at the board, really uses this data, and how do we kind of support them in that work?
Sure. I mean, I kind of feel like also, since I think the panel can talk about it, especially Dr. Truax. Um, but I mean, I think these are numbers that they're used, people inside of central office are using. These are also things that um, people inside of schools are using it to understand what their rates look like. I mean, I think what's helpful about this is, there's some numbers that the district produces, but what we also provide is a way of looking at it over time, which is something that a lot of schools don't have access to, and also what happens to their students after they graduate, particularly around college completion. So I think there's like this huge range of people. Also, I think we're starting our outreach to board members around this information, and my colleague Alex Usher and I will be at the board comment session tomorrow, so we can share these numbers because we feel like this is something that's really important to kind of benchmark where we're at right now, but also to mark, these enormous changes that are so fundamental to the lives of students in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I think the one other question to maybe ask before we move on, and just to flag, Shelby and Jenny and the data team will continue to answer some of the more technical questions in the background, and I will try to save some of these other questions for after the panel as well, because we're getting so many great data questions in here. I think the other one that's kind of interesting that came in from Maureen Keller is, are there national numbers available for the number of Pell eligible students who enrolled in and graduated from college in
Good
the high school
question.
graduating class of 2018?
It's a good question. I know, Shelby, because I know you were looking more closely at this. Maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, this is a great question. So, I believe the answer is yes. The only part I'm not sure about is for the class of 2018 specifically, but high level, certainly the proportion of undergraduates who are Pell eligible is available. And actually, there's a great piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education I can link that has some of those rates, and then also the completion rates for Pell eligible students. I don't think, unfortunately, it's for 2018 specifically, but it can still be a good comparison point. And then someone else had asked about comparisons just for students from urban school districts or districts more similar to CPS. And I'll also put in chat, there are some estimates from the National Student Clearinghouse of rates of college enrollment just for students from high poverty high schools and for students from urban school districts. So I can link both of those in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shelby and Jenny, for taking us through the rates and through the post-secondary attainment index itself. Really appreciate you sharing that context for us to kind of set us up for the next section of our webinar today. So thank you both so much. So now that we have clarity about where we are as a system, I'm really excited to transition to the panel where we can really lead into our curiosity and begin to make sense of the data that was just shared. As we say here at To&Through, data is not the answer. It's about what we do with the data that matters. Our three powerhouse panelists will share their unique perspectives about where we can go next. Together, they represent how people, practice, and policy can work together to drive collective results and the expanded accountability needed to continue improving opportunities for all CPS students to complete a degree. Let's start by introducing our panelists. And first up, we have Dr. Heidi Truax, who uses she, her, hers pronouns. She is a 2025 Marquis Who's Who in America recipient and is the executive director of the Office of School Counseling and Post-Secondary Advising with Chicago Public Schools, where she is responsible for providing professional development, programming, and data-informed, strategy-driven initiatives for 600 plus schools and 320,000 students across CPS. In 2022, OSCPA's work was nationally celebrated with the Partner of Hope Award by the National Post-Secondary Strategy Institute in partnership with Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative. Prior to becoming the executive director of OSCPA, Dr. Truax served as a school counselor within CPS from 2009 to 2020, earning the 2020 School Counselor of the Year award for the state of Illinois. Dr. Truax holds a licensed professional counselor certification and earned her PhD in counselor education and supervision from Adler University in 2018. For 4 years, from 2017 to 2021, Dr. Truax also served as a clinical assistant professor of school counseling at Roosevelt University. Welcome, Heidi. Next up, we have Lisa Kurian Philip, who is the higher education reporter for WBEZ Chicago in partnership with Open Campus Media. Through student-centered audio stories, she focuses on issues of racial equity in college access and completion. She grew up in the Chicago area, but spent much of her adult life elsewhere until returning back to Chicago in 2022. Before joining WBEZ, she covered education for North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome, Lisa. And last but not least, we have Dr. Kyle Southern, Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion, where he focuses on ensuring the sustainability of organizational resources and empowerment of the team to advance solutions that address historic inequities in our higher education system, especially for students of color and low-income students. PCC does this work in close collaboration with advocacy and institutional partners, as well as state and system level policymakers. Previously, as Associate Vice President at the Institute for College Access and Success, Dr. Southern led work to improve college completion rates and to strengthen protections for students and their families. Prior to TICAS, at Young Invincibles, he coordinated the organization's efforts to make higher education more accessible and affordable. Dr. Southern holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies and a master's in education policy from Vanderbilt University, and he completed the PhD program in higher and post-secondary education at the University of Michigan. Awesome. Welcome, Kyle. This is going to be a really, really phenomenal panel, and I'm very excited that I get to lead it today because you all have a lot of great insights that you're going to share, and I'm really excited to just dive right in. So, for our opening question, I'd love to hear from each of you, and we'll start with Kyle, and just hear a little bit about like how are you making sense of this data from your unique vantage point in this work?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. And I first want to say, congratulations on this work. It's just so important for us, and especially when data and data infrastructure at the federal level are being undermined, as was rightly noted at the top of this conversation. These kind of localized city and state efforts are essential to know how to move forward for our students. Overall, I think that this data speaks so much to the critical work that folks like Heidi and her team and people across CPS are doing to support student success. But just very briefly to start with, and I'll say more about this later, when we think about the through part of getting to and through college, I think the data really show the necessity of more investment in our students when they make that step into the post-secondary sector. And beyond that, we know that we as a state have collectively disinvested in our public institutions of higher education for a long time. And I think that we're seeing a cascade effect of that in more and more institutions that are really doing the yo person's work of trying to increase those post-secondary outcomes. For too long, they've done a lot more with a lot less. And it's really time for us to step up as a state and better invest in those institutions. So I'll say more about that later, but those are my kind of top line impressions to begin with.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Lisa, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. As Kyle was kind of hinting at what's been going on in higher ed kind of historically and across the state, what are your kind of reactions to the data as a reporter who's covering these topics?
Yeah, like Kyle, I'm sort of looking at this from the perspective of historically what's happened in the state in terms of public disinvestment, especially as I've covered higher ed more and more, I've been paying more attention to persistence and completion rates. I think when I first came in, a lot of my stories were about college access because that's where so much of the public discussion has been, and there's less awareness around making sure students get to the finish line. Because, if you have a few college credits and you don't have that degree and you now have this student debt that you can't support with, the salary of a college graduate, like that's almost, some people would argue you're worse off than if you had gone at all. So that's been like the orientation of a lot of my recent reporting, especially as we see so many campus supports, especially for marginalized students, attacked over this past year with, things like the cultural centers at University of Illinois, Chicago, that students there really prize and say, like, this is what pulled me through my degree. As those kinds of things kind of come under the microscope because of these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think, while I'm interested in the enrollment numbers, I definitely have been paying a lot of attention to the completion rates and just what, universities are trying to do to really reverse those trends. And I talked to Kyle like a few weeks ago about Chicago State and how a place like that has really been trying to do so much to invest in its students, but it's also working against this, historic or the declining public investment in our state's universities.
Thank you. That's such great perspective to share. And I think that the distinguishing between enrollment and persistence and completion is like a really important part that I think we'll come back to a couple times in our conversation today. Heidi, let's get your initial thoughts and reactions to all of this from somebody who's sitting in the seat working with, high schoolers and helping them make that first step towards enrollment.
Actually, I wish I was working with high schoolers directly. I don't get to do that anymore. But I do get to support a bunch of incredible people that do that every day, right? So, I think that's the first thing I would note when I see this data. I see each and every one of our students, and I see each and every one of the school-based staff and network-based staff and district staff and families and community members and college access partners and higher ed institutions that are all investing and pouring into our young people to really support their trajectory through this process, because it is a process, as we all know, right? I think too, just the thing I would add that likely won't come out later as we dig into some of these other questions is just all of the students that aren't represented here. And I think that's important to lift, right? Like this data, when we're talking about completion, is specific to the National Student Clearinghouse. So institutions that don't report to NSC, all of our students that seek military pathways, that go straight into entrepreneurship, that seek out trades, that, right, I could go on, they are not represented here, and they too are successful. And so I do want to just lift that, like anytime we're looking at a data set, we're recognizing where our work is working, where our work needs to improve, and also who's missing from this that we also need to find different ways to learn about. So we're supporting them as well.
I love that. Thank you for elevating that, Heidi, because I think that's a really important point in this discussion. And I think in all of the work we do at To&Through, we really try to think about whose story are we not telling and how do we continue to highlight that and make sure we're giving a full picture of what success looks like for students once they leave CPS. We're going to continue with our first question for you. And CPS has been leading some really incredible work around this, around post-secondary access and success and completion. So I'd love for you to share what initiatives that you all have been leading that really connect to the numbers we see in this year's report, and what are some of the things you're really prioritizing moving forward?
All right, y'all. I could spend the next hour and a half talking about this question alone. So I'm going to try and rein it in and give you some highlights. So I think first and foremost, when you're talking about initiatives that CPS has been leading that connect to the numbers in this report, I want to talk about the investment in school counselors and in really robust programming that the district has been able to provide, in part because of ESSER funds that no longer exist. But we have to lift that, right? Like this is a class that, as much as they suffered from COVID, they also benefited from an influx of supports and resources that are just like that are relatively unprecedented in history, that are really incredible, right? I think thinking about high school graduation, some of the key initiatives I would highlight are a growth in what we now call High School Connection. For those of you who've been around CPS for a long time, it used to be called Freshman Connection, but it is that bridge program in summer between 8th grade and 9th grade to really support a healthy transition into high school. We know that to be really pivotal for 9th grade on track, which we know then is a good indicator of graduation within 4 years. I think investments around mentoring programming, around out of school time programming, and you heard that in the student voices from the qualitative research of clubs and social connections and increase in athletic opportunities, all make a huge difference in young people's success. There's also been adjustments in credit recovery access, and something I think you're going to see in media a lot over the next month is just huge investments in increased offerings for advanced coursework and rigorous coursework, from AP and IB to dual credit and dual enrollment, and other programming that has really thrived, particularly in the partnership with the Chicago Roadmap and our city colleges of Chicago. Looking at like the college enrollment aspect, then I lean more into the stuff on that my team more directly gets to impact, that I hold a lot of pride about, and want to lift up the directors within my team, Dr. Miguel Saucedo, Gretchen Rhodes, Brian Harris, and Jenny Zuluaga, who lead such incredible work in creating policies, practices, resources, professional development, to make sure that our schools have access to things that will support students. So here I want to call it a few things. In the last couple of years, we've really driven down and developed a clear and functional post-secondary advising framework that's actually based on research on CPS students and alumni. We've created a professional development cohort for all our post-secondary leadership teams, where those teams can then earn grant awards to do impact goals and exposure visits. Brian Harris and his team has really led the charge in our district being the first district managed direct admissions program in the country, where every single senior in CPS gets an email in the fall telling them of all the institutions. There are 89 now participating colleges and universities in our direct admissions program, where students are automatically knowing like, whoa, what, I got in, right? All I have to do is apply. You're already telling me I got in. All I have to do is do this application. That's unprecedented. Now we know there's a state one, but ours is better. Don't tell anyone, just because its access point is different and it's getting even easier. So by next school year, those same institutions will have the ability to actually say, we don't even need students to apply. We're comfortable opting out of that process. You just give us certain key data that their parents had said is okay to share, and we can admit them automatically. And then the district really has returned to providing college fairs at a massive scale. We've had high schools that have been able to do this successfully for a long time, but the smaller high schools struggle. And so being able to offer those at the district level and really target our smaller high schools in attendance, offering a highly selective college fair where we know some of those highly selective institutions are less likely to go to our neighborhood schools. So we're going to bring the neighborhood school students to them. And then increase in investment in scholarship supports, leading to over $3 billion being awarded to the class of 2025. For the class of 24, highlighted in here, it was over $2 billion. And then I know I'm at time, but I have to just talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that support college completion. So much of the completion rates, as To&Through did such a good job of highlighting, really does rely on our higher ed partners and in the state and the country investing in higher education so that they can invest in their students. But I am really proud of the work that Jenny Zuluaga has led for the district around the Alumni Support Initiative, where the district now provides and has provided, we're in year 4, a full year, 2 years of summer and winter support to CPS alumni, where high school staff are trained as alumni coordinators, and they track outreach and engagement and post-secondary confirmations for our 2 most recent graduated classes. And that programming also includes an alumni voice advisory committee and family transition mentors that are supporting parents in the process, and an emergency fund, thanks to our philanthropic partners. So there's so much going on there that we don't yet see the fruits pay off of in completion because it's new enough that we're not at that 6-year grad rate, but we see the impact on persistence rates, right? So we're this year got to announce a record-breaking current persistence rate for the class of 2023 of 75%. And if we drill down in that and look at schools, over 100 schools participate in Alumni Support Initiative of our high schools. If you drill down and look at those schools that are district managed and leverage the Alumni Support Initiative, that percentage rate goes up to 79%. That's 4 percentage points simply because the adults in the building and the district has invested to say we're going to do this 2 years of support. And then the last thing I will lift is the College Compact. So we're in year 6 of offering a College Compact that convenes over 35 of our institutions where students are top attendees, and really bring them together to work on matters of admissions, enrollment, but also student affairs and financial aid that are so key in young people persisting. And again, thanks to philanthropy, we've been able to offer what we call the Promising Practices Innovation Fund, where we invite those compact partners to be awarded grants to implement one or more of our promising practices that research shows really drives retention and persistence of urban students, but specifically Chicago public school students. As far as what we're prioritizing moving forward, just getting more consistent in equitable implementation of all those incredible services, really closing opportunity gaps. I think one of the projects we're really excited about right now is the HBCU collaborative that we're launching in collaboration with Chicago Public Schools Black Student Success Plan, where we're really reaching out and connecting with HBCUs to identify areas of convergence and hoping to address some of those structural obstacles that are really inhibiting some HBCU enrollment. Because it's important to note that we have an opportunity gap where our Black students need to be more successful. We want to support them in being more successful. And what we see is that when they enroll in HBCUs, their persistence rates are above the district average. When we know that your report even shows that's not true, if we look at them outside of those HBCU enrollments. So really wanting to do some of that targeted work to close those opportunity gaps.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heidi. I'm always impressed with all the great work your team is doing and all the layers of CPS and all the partners you all work with and convene to make this work possible and to really provide those supports. Lisa, I want to move to you and kind of connect to some of what Heidi shared in that this work is really about people, right? There's the people who are supporting the students. It's about the students themselves. It's about the families. And that really is so much the focus of your work and your reporting in higher education. And that really centers those experiences. So can you share a story of a student, a practitioner, or a family that you've talked to in the last 2 years that connects to some of the data we've been discussing today?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to share the story of a counselor at Downers Grove South. I know it's not a CPS school, but it was Downers Grove South in the suburbs, because I was able to follow him throughout I'm going to screw up the year because time is a meaningless circle, but the year basically that the FAFSA essentially broke down with the federal, government trying to make this new version that was then riddled with bugs, especially ones that impacted marginalized students. And this counselor, LaVon Robinson, so much of his core purpose is around helping marginalized students. And some of that has to do with his personal background. He is from a low-income family. He didn't have a ton of guidance in terms of getting to college. His mom was very much prioritized education, but he didn't have a lot of guidance in terms of how to get to college and what kind of institution should he be looking at, what kinds of questions should he be asking to figure out where he might do well. And he ended up getting an athletic scholarship to Illinois State. And he just talked about how that was such a life-changing experience for him. Fortunately, it turned out to be a good fit. And he really found his purpose there in terms of helping other students like him have an experience like that. So I basically got to visit him every month, every couple of months throughout the school year to kind of see how his work was taking place and sit in on conversations with students that he was having. And, while this goal of helping marginalized students who really need financial aid the most, right, was so much of what he sort of oriented himself around, it became so difficult that year. And it already was difficult. And he talked about how a lot of his low-income students are already barely bought into the idea of going to college because of distrust in educational systems and, the cost and so many of these barriers that, and then another thing I thought he was very interesting. What he talked about was just that because of these many challenges, these students that need the most help from him in terms of navigating this process that is wildly confusing and has a million steps. And if your parents have or family members haven't gone through this, a 17-year-old, you don't know what you're doing. But so many of those students that really needed his help were the least likely to seek it out. And there was only so much he could do because he has, almost 200 kids on his caseload. And so he tried his best to focus on what was in his office, happening in his office. So I think just, he has this personal mission, but there are so many challenges in terms of helping students get to where they are. And some of the persistence and like completion piece part of the story was that he was trying to help these students make these decisions about where to go to college. And they, because of the FAFSA delays, had so little information about how much aid they were going to get. And that really impacts whether a student is going to persist through college. If they commit to a place and then realize it's, they're going to have to take out private loans, or, there's a mistake and actually they get way less aid than they had been estimated, that's obviously going to impact a student's ability to stay in college. So it was just a really eye-opening experience, both to see his work, but then to hear from students who were kind of juggling this and really like valued, despite all, there's this federal narrative or national narrative about whether students still value college, whether it presents value to them. And of course, a lot of the data counteracts that in terms of like more and more jobs are going to require a college degree. But to see these students really fighting for this opportunity, and then to see this practitioner, this counselor really invested and trying to do his best, was a really amazing experience. And I think our listeners really appreciated hearing from like behind the scenes. So many people don't realize all the things that counselors do. And so it was great to like get a peek behind the scenes.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's so important to add that nuance and that humanness and the complexity of these stories. To your point, like counselors and students are like trying to move mountains to do things that society is telling them they should be doing. And we have systems and structures in place that constantly put barriers in their way instead of removing them. And I think both you and Heidi are really highlighting the need for us to think about systematically, how do we remove those barriers? Because these kids and these families want this for themselves, but we have to make it easier for them, not harder. So with that, I want to move on to Kyle. And you bring lots of national and policy experience to your new role at PCC. And I think bringing the national perspective here is really important. So when you see the data and you kind of look at national comparisons, what do you see as areas of celebration and areas of opportunity here? And also, what do you see as unique about Illinois and Chicago when it comes to college access and completion?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And actually, Lisa set me up really well because I wanted to sort of start by noting the sort of drumbeat and narrative that really, I think, undercuts the idea of, do you actually need to go to college? And Heidi rightly pointed out there are many ways to be successful. But we also know the growing share of living wage work that's going to require some form of post-secondary education. It doesn't need to be necessarily a bachelor's degree, but you're going to need something beyond that high school diploma really to have access to those kind of career opportunities. The data here, and I think nationally, are telling a very similar story, which is there is that narrative that we're hearing from maybe federal policymakers or in big press outlets, all due respect, but students and families are voting with their feet, and they recognize the challenge, and there are these age-old questions about how much should that cost, who should pay it, how are they going to pay it. Those are perennial questions, and more families and students are being squeezed on their family budgets in the face of this kind of disinvestment that we've seen. Because what happens when the state puts less funding in their public institutions, the place where most folks go, they still have to keep the lights on. Many have deferred maintenance issues. They need to have faculty teach classes and folks to keep the institutions running. More and more of those costs continue to get put onto our students and families, and that only exacerbates strains on our financial aid programs. So here in the state, what both is and isn't unique is that this kind of challenge isn't just an accident or some phenomenon we don't have any control over. These are policy choices that we collectively make, right? And unless we make different policy choices and sort of bend that cost curve by virtue of investing in institutions that are doing the best job at serving all students, and especially those students who are Black, Latino first generation from low-income backgrounds, we're not going to be able to fundamentally bend that curve of completion because we know from research, we know from experience the kinds of things that we need to do to boost those rates and better ensure those student success. And as I said at the top, a lot of folks have been doing a lot more with a lot less for much too long. And I really hope that we as a state have an opportunity to invest more in those students and in those communities. But broadly, the trends are, if you look at the Student Clearinghouse data, nationally from last fall to this fall, there was a 4% increase in our community colleges nationally in enrollment, 2% in our public 4 years, I think 1% in our private 4 years. Those may not be huge numbers, they're just percentages, but behind those percentages are lots of people, right? And so we do have to celebrate that both from the data here in this report and also nationally, but we know that enrollment is just the start of that path, right? And if you think about our transfer student population, here in Illinois, consider the fact that 80% of students who start in our community colleges indicate an interest in transferring and going on to a bachelor's degree, but only about a third of them will actually make that transfer, and only about 1 out of 5 will ultimately get that bachelor's degree. And so we have to be reflective about how are we letting that many students fall through the cracks. It's often one unexpected medical bill or a car repair or a food security issue that can lead to those folks making that really difficult decision to step away. But often that delay leads to life happening, and they don't get back to that degree, and then they find themselves not being able to actually achieve that goal. So again, we have the tools, we have the research. Your colleagues and so many others have the data. We know what we need to do, I think. And we just need to make the policy choices and have the courage to do it.
I love that. Yeah, I think just the emphasis on like kind of this collective action and making different types of decisions if we really want to change things is really necessary right now for us to kind of stand up on what we believe in and our values and what is necessary to really support students to achieve the aspirations they have for themselves and make that really a true possibility. So for the next question, I want to get responses from maybe 2 of you, and then we'll do one more question to get everybody's kind of closing remarks. But one of the main opportunities that kind of has been discussed throughout is this opportunity around college completion. And we've also been talking a lot about like the importance of systems and structures in doing that. So would love to hear a little bit about what systems and structures have most contributed to student success in higher education from your unique vantage points, and where could higher educations continue to support and improve that work towards college completion efforts. So any 2 of you who'd like to kind of take that question or have some thoughts you'd like to share.
I think Heidi should start.
All right, Heidi, passed it to you.
I appreciate that, Kyle. I was itching to talk. Y'all, there's so much we could partner on, and there's so much I think that higher ed institutions want to do, but just haven't fiscally been able to do. And then other things where like they don't have the bandwidth to do, right? And so there's the human capital aspect too. And we haven't seen institutions still make moves that that are shown to really impact persistence and completion rates for students. So some things that like I would really highlight, y'all need to start waiving out of state tuition consistently if you want our students to go and be successful on your campuses. Change your funding model to meet full need of students. You can have it be criteria based still, but like the institutions even locally here in Chicago that have moved to a meet full need model are seeing our students attend their campuses and be successful, to persist, to be retained, to complete. That's incredibly impactful for generations and for our entire community. And then in lieu of being able to do that, like partner and have emergency funds available for things like what Kyle was just mentioning. So much of what we hear from our college compact partners is that, they dig into why a student dropped out, and it's because they couldn't afford to come home for their mom's birthday and then make it back to campus. But it was really important for them to be there for mom's birthday because she has a terminal illness, or because X, Y, and because it's their mom. Like that's enough, right? And so like how do we root out some of these really seemingly incremental things that are monumental given the context, through things like emergency funds, offering more Chicago public school student specific scholarships, right? Like it's really easy to offer a DEI scholarship and not call it that if you just say it's for a Chicago public school student. Hi, help us out here, please. That would be great. And then just other things that we've seen really impact persistence and completion on campuses are like bridge programs, right? Like much like High School Connection helps us with our retention of eighth graders into high school. If you can offer a summer bridge program for students from high school onto your college campus, even a couple of weeks before the real semester starts to bridge them into being successful, that's incredibly helpful. Mentorship programs, cohort-based programs. Essentially, anytime a college campus makes intentional supports for a targeted population, that targeted population does better. It equals higher completion. And so that's what we want to see more and more of our higher ed partners doing. And that's what we want to partner with them on. Because again, like we really do feel like we are on the hook and want to be on the hook for young people's college completion. But we need our allies, our partners in this to really make that possible.
Lisa, are you okay if I jump in, or are you itching to get in?
No, I want to hear you.
Okay, good. I want to call out two things. Well, first, at a more local level, I'm thinking about partnerships like at Chicago State with their recently launched Elevate 17 initiative, partnering with a broad set of organizations and groups on the south side of Chicago, recognizing the sort of core mission that that institution has and the population that they're serving, and bringing all those partners together. That's one kind of model and approach. And we haven't taught, Heidi mentioned earlier the importance of dual enrollment, but we've seen CSU double their dual enrollment over recent years, and we know that some of their enrollment rebound is attributable to that, and that's true particularly in the community college sector nationally. And so really, I think recognizing how to support the increasingly like bimodal college student, which is we're more and more getting more dual enrollment students who are coming over from high schools, and we're getting students who are late 20s, early 30s, have different life circumstances than that traditional college age. And so we've got many structures and policies, particularly at the federal level, that are at least a decade, maybe a generation behind on who actually who college students are today. So we need to catch up with that. Everything about systems and structures to best support students, I would call out and encourage folks to support the adequate and equitable funding legislation that's now pending in the General Assembly, and that'll be PCC's top legislative priority going into next year. That will both infuse more needed funding into our public institutions, and especially target those toward the institutions that are doing the most to serve populations for too long underserved by our current systems. By our estimates, that'll lead to about 30,000 more graduates over the coming years. That's going to be literally billions of dollars of additional tax revenue for the state. We'll hear a narrative about how do we pay for this, but really the benefits to us as a society and as an economy are going to far outweigh the costs that are associated with that. As my colleague Mike Abrahamson often says, like this is something we really can't afford not to do as a state. So please look up the AEF legislation led by Representative Ammons and Senator Lightford in the General Assembly, and write your legislators and encourage them to support that. I also can't let this conversation leave without acknowledging what's happening in our community with these ICE raids and the intimidation and patrolling and instilling fear in many of our communities. That's an education issue, because if students and families don't feel safe leaving their homes to go to school or work, they're not going to be prepared to be successful graduates and go on to college. If people are being kidnapped off of our streets, they're not going to be able to complete their college degrees. And so whatever we can do to stand up and in solidarity and to fight for our immigrant communities in particular is something that I think we as a community owe it to all of us to do.
Thank you, Kyle, for kind of closing out your remarks there and reminding us of the very real challenges that communities are facing right now and how that does all impact education. Um, there's a lot going on in the world and a lot of ways that we're continuing to undermine the things that do best set young people and families up for long-term success. And if we don't acknowledge those challenges and stand up for, that kind of fear mongering in our communities, it's going to have really very real consequences. But I also want to say thank you to you and Heidi for sharing like really practical ways to continue to do this across systems and in spaces and offering really practical takeaways for what higher education can be thinking about. We can all be thinking about from a local funding perspective as well. So thank you both for that. So to close us out on a positive note, I want to ask kind of what's giving you hope? Like we've discussed a lot of different things. There's a lot to celebrate. There are definitely some opportunities and some challenges ahead as well. But when you think about kind of our discussion today, what is giving you hope and what's kind of your call to action for this group around how we can all continue to improve the attainment of CPS students? And Lisa, maybe we'll actually start with you.
Yeah, sounds good. I love talking about this. And like over the past year, as things, have gotten so dire, it's something I like to ask of people I'm talking to at the end of an interview, just because we all need it right now. But I think something that gives me hope is like basically every time I get to go talk to a young person about their higher education journey, their goals, how they're responding to this time too. I've just seen so many students step up and really fight for each other, fight for themselves. Just like a week or two ago, I met this student who is 19 years old. She graduated from UIC last year, and she started this it's called the Civic Success Project to really, she saw this issue of like, all my classmates, feel like they want to get involved and want to do something to change, to help each other, to help their communities in this time. And they don't know what to do because maybe they've never taken a civic action before. So she started this nonprofit, and right now she's running a matchmaking program where she pairs young adults who have similar interests or have never taken a civic action before. And over the next couple months, they'll do something like clean up their city block or volunteer at the local library or, things along those lines. So I think, that's kind of what's pulling me through this time. It's just seeing these young people continue to like go to school and balance that with work and then also like run a project like this. It's
beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Heidi.
I just have to mimic, like, the thing that gives me hope is our students, right? Every single day that our young people get out of bed and they make it to high school and they make it through the day, that's inspiring to me. The hurdles in that act alone every single day for so many of our students are so incredible. As a school counselor for enough years, like, I just recognize how glad I am that they're here every day. That really gives me hope. Stories like I got an email this morning from a network chief celebrating that they had a student who arrived to one of the high school's campuses in 2024. Tibetan is their native language. They earned English proficiency last spring, and now she's got a full ride to Stanford. That gives me hope. Right. And as far as a call to action, y'all, like, we created the barriers that exist. We did that. We created the barriers that exist and we've maintained them. And that tells me that they can also be removed. They can also be modified. They can be altered. They can be adjusted so that each and every student has access to and the ability to get to and through college or whatever their life after high school is designed to be. And so that's where I call each of us is to really listen and see with bold vulnerability, where we've gone wrong, and how we can keep adjusting to do better.
Thank you, Heidi. And Kyle, I'm going to let you close us out.
Sure. And thanks again for the chance to be part of this conversation. It's a real honor to be in a community with all of you. I thought of this question. I found hope in a very unlikely place recently, which was I had the opportunity, along with my colleague Mike, to visit the Danville Correctional Center way downstate a few weeks ago to visit with U of I's Education Justice Project students who are incarcerated there. Eastern Illinois and Danville Community College also have programs at that facility. We had the chance to sit in and then became part of a class around American social movements. And the eagerness of every student there to learn more and engage and to be prepared, because 95% of those folks are going to come home. And I think we as a state have an obligation. If you want to talk about ROI on investing in higher education, our prison education programs are among the critical places to do that. I happen to believe we as a state are not doing nearly enough on that front, because 201, every student that I talked to there asked me about our work. They asked about how they could advocate for themselves. They wanted to get more degree programs. They said, is there a way that we can write letters or testify for what you're trying to do on funding for college when the legislature comes back? To be in that literally the most marginalized community that we have, but for people who fervently believe in the power and value of higher education is something that I think we have to take with us and remember their voices and the simple desire they have just for the chance that higher ed provides. And that's the thing that I think has to fuel us to keep going. I'll offer that. And then for a more tangible kind of next step, I mentioned our advocacy around increasing funding for adequate and equitable education around the state, which will benefit all institutions. I'd invite everyone to look up and join us at the Coalition for Transforming Higher Education Funding, which is a coalition of our advocacy partners to help do that. So I want us to remember those students who we can't see from day to day, but who are asking for opportunity, while also continuing to fight for all students to get the support that they need to reach their dreams.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure to facilitate this conversation. You all shared such unique insights from your positions in this work and all the expertise and knowledge and experience you have and how you brought that to bear here to really contextualize the numbers that we shared and like really bring to light the people and the stories and the work that goes behind all those numbers and the nuances and complexities of really doing this work. So I really, really want to thank you so much for your time and your insights and your perspectives. I'm going to ask one question, one final question that came up. Because I think this question about funding came up a lot. So I think I'd love to get like just very quick responses to like, given we're seeing funding challenges in CPS, we're seeing funding challenges in higher ed in the state and federally. Like, how do we make tough decisions given all these funding challenges and knowing where we need to make some of these investments? And I know nobody's going to have like, there's no silver bullet here. But I think just given all the great insights you all share, would love to just get kind of final thoughts on that last question, because that did come up a lot from folks throughout the discussion. I know it's a meaty last question, but I feel like we should get one good one in there before we close out. All right, Kyle, you want to start?
Ask it one more time, like
Yes.
very direct.
Very direct is like, how do we make tough decisions given kind of all the funding challenges we're facing from K-12 all the way through higher ed and also nationally?
I have the the privilege of being able to call for that without making those tough decisions as a legislator. But I think recent history is instructive. We just had a veto session a couple of weeks ago where huge questions about how we fund public transit and other key things that we need as a city and as a state were on the table. And they found a way to pass legislation, big legislation. They found a way to pass comprehensive legislation that better protected a lot of our communities. When there's political will and practical necessity, legislators and executive folks can come together and make these solutions possible. Again, it's about tough choices. I don't have to be at that table to know that, because you can read it in the news. You can go into a session like that and say, they've only got 72 hours to solve this huge problem, but nothing gets you to that kind of endpoint like those folks wanting to go home. And so they find a way to make a compromise and make a way forward. So I continue to believe that there's a path, and it will require some tough choices, but they can get made.
All right, I said nose goes, but I'm going to chime in. I just feel like we have to, as we make tough choices, we have to remember to put the actual students first, and not just the student data or the statistics, but actual students, some of the stories you've heard today, some of the stories that we hear day in and day out, the real lives of our young people need to be at the center as we make hard decisions. And like, we need to keep thinking about things at the systems level, right? That I think is something I've really had to lean into is as now a district leader, which is very different than when I got to be just a school counselor and think about my students within my building, is now like, how do we make the hard decisions that center each individual student while recognizing what is most scalable, what will have the best positive impact on the most students, what's structural, what's systemic, that we can really prioritize to meet each of those student stories. That's sort of the crux of the lens that I think is right as we make these critically frustrating decisions about cutbacks, where we're already doing a lot with a little. But as if we have to keep doing that, I think that's the only approach I can stomach for how to approach those decisions.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts you want to chime in before we close out?
Like Kyle, I'm grateful it's not my actual decision to make, my job to make these decisions, these tough financial decisions. But I think, Kyle brought up the funding formula that legislators are still considering. And I think just as a state, we need to not just think about, short-term funding needs, but where higher ed kind of plays a role in the future and in our long-term success as a state. And I'm constantly hearing, even from people within my newsroom, like, well, college is so expensive, is it still worth it? And I'm like, go look at the numbers, like go look at Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers. It's all out there. In 10 years, like, most jobs are going to require some sort of post-secondary education. And I think just as a state, we need to think about whether we want to be set up for that or we don't. And how much of a priority is that?
Thank you. That was a great way to close us out. I'm just so honored that you guys agreed to do this and share your perspectives with us. Thank you again for everything you shared and highlighted. I think my kind of big takeaways are around like focus on the students and the people. And that's a good reminder that we have a lot of power to also change these systems. I think, as Heidi really said so eloquently, like, we can advocate for these changes to policy downstate and making sure we have funding formulas that give the investments where we need them in higher education and in K-12 education to continue to support this work. But that takes people, and it takes all of us coming together to do that work and to make bold moves and decisions on behalf of students that recognize their stories and the unique challenges they're facing, and how we can systematize what we know works so that everybody really and truly does have access to the opportunities that they need. So thank you all again so much for joining us. And we're going to just close out this day with a couple final collective kind of calls to action. Um, so before we close out, collective action is kind of the big takeaway for the end of the day. And I think our panelists shared a few specific takeaways, but I also wanted to highlight a couple resources we have at To&Through to help you decide what some of those collective actions might be that align really well with what our panelists shared today. So one, we had so much talking about centering student voice and experience, and that's something we're very passionate about here at To&Through and believe deeply in. We already mentioned the student stories. That's how Shelby started, with highlighting some of those quotes about the challenges students were facing. And we have so many amazing students, and we're also starting to build out family stories about how young people and their families are navigating post-secondary journeys. So I encourage you to definitely go check those out if you haven't. They're incredible resources and really get into some of the complexities around what is, creating challenges around persistence for students, and what are some of the things we as a system can do to help remove those barriers for our young people. The other thing I just want to highlight again, because it came up a ton in the Q&A function as we were going through our discussions today, a lot of the questions that folks pose throughout the data presentation and throughout the conversation with our panelists can actually be answered on our To&Through milestones tool. So we definitely encourage you to check that out. You can look at specific data on a certain school. You can look at top enrolling institutions for Black students. You can look at data on charters, neighborhood schools. You can look at it by elected school board region, right? So there's a lot of different ways. We actually started sharing data in the last year or two from higher ed institutions, with a shout out to city colleges for making their data public. So there's a lot of information on there that will answer some of the more in-depth questions that folks posed in the Q&A function today that relate back to this data. As you can see, those particular milestones for the communities and that are most important to you, and continuing to figure out what your next steps are today. So we're going to close by asking you in the chat to do what we asked our panelists to do. We would love for you to share in chat one action you hope to take after today to better support the attainment of CPS students. The chat will be open just briefly for this moment. So I'm going to give people a minute or two just to go ahead and throw some responses in there, because we'd really love to get some collective action going now, and we'll definitely follow up with some more resources on how to do this and some other next steps that kind of came out from today's conversation as well. The chat is activated and we're starting to get some responses. So give people another minute or two. People are really resonating with centering students, doing some more advocacy work, encourage parent and community engagement, sharing this data and information so other folks make informed decisions about their post-secondary options, connecting with youth directly to see what their needs are, pushing for FAFSA completion. I love how we've got responses that are both really like tactical and in the weeds, and also big picture, because I think that's kind of the beauty of this space, right? We've got folks working at every level, and all of that work is critically important to what we're doing. Please continue throwing those answers in the chat. We'll try to pull these out at the end so that when we send our recap email in a couple of days, that includes the deck, that includes the presentation, we'll have a recording of that. You'll have all that information so you can continue to think about your next steps. But I'm going to do two final quick plugs for a couple other spaces where we're going to continue to have this conversation. This is just the start. This is kind of what we think of as the kickoff to us having ongoing conversations about this data in different spaces and in different ways throughout the next year. So a couple upcoming spaces to do that. We have a data collab where Kids First is going to be sharing their state of CPS report. So some additional data points we can look at. We have our milestones tool workshop. So for folks that had all those specific questions about those communities or young people in your life, this is a space where you can start to get some understanding of those rates for you. And then I also really want to highlight an exciting opportunity we'll have in February to particularly dive into the impact of this data on Black students and their college going and completion rates. That will be highlighting some of the work Heidi mentioned around the Black Student Success Plan and some of the initiatives and work that are going on there. And then finally, we are always open to coming to talk through this data with you and your team and figuring out how to support you in understanding and making meaning of it for yourself so that you can continue to make an impact across the system. So please feel free to reach out to us directly as well if you're wishing to do that. So in closing, I just want to say a huge thank you again to Dr. Truax, Dr. Southern, and Lisa for joining our panel, to Jenny and Shelby for going through all of the component rates and the PAI itself to help people understand what is behind that data. And I really hope our goals of helping folks across the system gain clarity on the progress we've made and the opportunities ahead, that we sparked your curiosity as you've grappled with the nuances of the data and who is and isn't being served, and that you leave with a sense of hope around the collective action we can all take to drive this work forward. Chicago already is a national leader when it comes to post-secondary access and success, and now is the time to own that position. We've proved that we can change outcomes and experiences for the better when we listen to young people, we use data to have hard conversations, and we work together. So let's keep that in mind as we continue our shared work of helping students access futures with agency and dignity. Thank you all so much for being here, and we really look forward to continuing to partner with you in this important work.